Good morning. This is Gary Chandler, Vice President of Government Affairs for the Association of Washington Business. Thank you for being with us today. This is the second year that we've done this, doing a session wrap-up. Unfortunately, though, we're calling it a session wrap-up, but as you know, the session is still going on. This is, as you know, the 64th legislative session. This is a supplemental year that we were in, a 60-day session. Unfortunately, once again, we are into a first special session. We're in the 15th day of that, and we still do not have a budget to be presented to the legislature as of today. Hopefully, through the weekend, they will be back at the table and be ready to run out a budget next week. You'll hear from the staff today of the issues that we dealt with going into this session. As I've told you, this is a supplemental year, so the supplemental budget, really all they need to do is to come in this year, look at the budget, make adjustments as to forecast, take a look at what the economy is doing, take a look at the caseloads, and then make adjustments to it. We certainly don't want new programs being started in a supplemental year that will create a bow wave into the next biennium. At the same time, one of the difficult things that they're struggling with is in 2012, they voted in to look at a 4-year budget. So everything they do this year, they have to look out 4 years as to how that affects the budget. There are some lawmakers that want to break that and not look at that 4-year budget. Go back to the old days where we were up and down every 2 years. The legislature in 2012, in their wisdom, said we need to be looking out a longer period of time so that we're not in the sessions of a roller coaster. Now some legislators want to go back to that. We're saying stay with the 4-year budget cycle. Everything you do today, look out over the 4-year period as to what it's going to affect. We certainly know going into 2017, we're going to have a tough budget year. And so we want to make sure also that they have a large carryover into 2017. And so we're watching that very carefully also as they go forward. So what I'm going to do is have each one of the staff come up and talk through the issue areas that they have this session and present that to you. And if they have issues that are still going on in the supplemental, they'll also talk about that. So let's start off with Sherry.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Sherry Nelson, and I am the Government Affairs Director for the healthcare issues. And this year started a little bit interesting in January during a work session of the Senate Ways and Means. The Healthcare Authority announced that they had a $191 million shortfall for the 2015 and 17 budget cycle. They were saying that this had to do with the increasing cost in managed care, and that they simply, with the actuarial estimates from Milliman, they were just off that much. That was disappointing news, certainly, to the Senate Ways and Means, who had thought that they had more than covered the additional cost for the 2015-17 budget. In addition, the Healthcare Authority also said that the projected savings that they had planned on having through the Healthier Washington, which is a bill that was generated by Governor Inslee and was expected in 2015, also was not going to be available. So you actually had a $195 million shortfall starting in January through the Healthcare Authority, which kind of put our budget at a huge loss to actually even initiate the legislative session. We were very successful this year in opposing legislation that was going to expand government authority. That would be House Bill 2445 in particular, that was going to expand 30-party administrators overseen by the Office of the Insurance Commissioner. We were able to diffuse some of the cost-sharing projects and legislation that had been put forward. Also, we were able to curb the appetite to hinder the private market, specifically within the healthcare industry. We were thrilled to partner with the Hospital Association in supporting Senate Bill 6519. That was the telemedicine bill. You might remember that in 2015 we were able to pass the telemedicine bill. This actually, 6519, will expand the services. It develops a collaborative process through the University of Washington where they'll be able to do some studying and look at the best way to increase that patient access, as well as how to budget for it, how to get reimbursement rates. In addition to that, what it also did was expand the coverage so that it didn't have have to be a community health center anymore, or a hospital or a clinic per se. They're now going out and saying that the appropriate place can also be a community health center as well as home. This is critical for our business members and our members who are located in small rural areas throughout the state, who aren't necessarily able to get to some of those bigger urban cities with the medical care that they're needing, in particular folks that are very fragile. So we were thrilled to partner with them. That right now is waiting on the governor's desk for his signature, one of many pieces of legislation, and you'll hear from my associates additional legislation that's waiting for the governor's signature. Unfortunately, one of the pieces of legislation that we supported and we were thrilled to pass, which is Senate Bill 6569, that had to do with creating a task force on patient out-of-pocket cost. Now, oftentimes we wouldn't be very supportive of a patient task force, but in this regard, we had over 140 pieces of legislation that were actually presented in that less than 60-day period, just alone in healthcare. That's an enormous amount of legislation to wade through, and oftentimes that legislation was targeted at out-of-patient cost, but it didn't have any scientific data. It didn't have the in-depth research that it needed to really have to be passed as legislation. So our hope was that with 6569, which was sponsored by Senator Cleveland down in the Vancouver region, that we would be able to really look at what are the patient out-of-pocket costs and how can we help our members reduce and some of those costs in the long term. That bill was vetoed by Governor Inslee recently. There is conversation about trying to bring that back to the table as the budget comes back on the floor eventually, we hope. But there isn't a lot of interest. There are actually 27 total bills that were vetoed at the same time as 6569. And so more to come on that one, I'm sure. As always, we remain available to try and assist you with your healthcare questions, with your healthcare needs, with what your issue is as a small or large business. In particular, we're looking at trying to get some legislation established and hear from you this spring. We'll be taking some steps this spring focusing on our small businesses, reaching out to you, and we certainly hope we'll be actually coming up to 12 cities. And we certainly hope that you can make the time or reach out to us and give us your input so that we can be more effective in addressing your needs in healthcare throughout Washington State. So thanks so much.
I might share as we're switching. Are we going to take questions right now for Sherry, or is there any questions that you have of Sherry before we switch staff? Okay, if not, I'm going to have Mike come up. And before Mike comes up around as they're transitioning, I might mention a couple days before session was over, the governor got very frustrated with the legislature that they were not getting their budget put together. And he threatened the legislature and said, if we go into special session, then I'm going to veto bills that come to my desk. And so he had about 37 bills that were on his desk, and out of that, he vetoed 27 bills. Because they did not get done on time. And so one of those bills that Sherry was talking about was one of those 27 that he vetoed, and he signed 10 of them. We don't know if his threat carries on now, and he's going to continue vetoing bills, or whether that was just on those 37. We'll see here shortly as he has to start signing more bills. So Mike, you want to cover your areas for us?
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Gary. Good morning. My name is Mike Ennis. I do transportation and land use policy for AWB. And just to expand a little bit on what Gary said, the governor is expecting to sign a host of transportation bills tomorrow or afternoon. Tomorrow's Transportation Day, as I like to call it, and there are about a dozen and a half transportation bills that the governor has indicated that he will sign tomorrow. One of those bills includes the supplemental transportation budget, and I'll give you a little bit of details on that one. So last year, the state did adopt a statewide transportation package. It was one of our top priorities for AWB. This year, the Transportation Committee decided that we wanted to prioritize the package and make sure that the legislature kept its commitment to the entire package. So we watched very closely how the House and Senate leaders treated the supplemental budget. We did not want to see a lot of big changes to the package. We wanted it to remain intact. And to a large extent, it did. Both chambers did pass a supplemental transportation budget. It represents about $8.6 billion in funding for the two-year biennium. This year, the transportation budget revenues did come in higher than expected, a little over $500 million more. Leaders decided to spend that money in a couple of different ways. One is they gave state patrol officers about a 5% raise. You heard a lot about salary increases or the state patrol troopers leaving the state patrol and going to other agencies because of higher pay. So the state decided that they wanted to raise salaries for state patrols and try to retain them as a trooper. The state lawmakers also increased funding for two 405 projects. They added about $45 million to help reduce congestion on 405. We've seen a lot in the news lately about congestion on that corridor and how the new hot lanes with the tolls are affecting congestion. The State Transportation Commission has also lifted tolls on nights and weekends, so you only have to pay tolls during the peak periods throughout the commute week. The transportation budget also increased fish passage barrier removals at a tune of about $100 million. So what and really no large changes to the Connecting Washington package that was adopted last year, and that was our top priority. So all of that is good news, and we expect the governor to sign the bill tomorrow. Another transportation bill that we worked closely on was House Bill 2413, having to do with aircraft fines. Last year, we worked to protect aircraft excise taxes. So just like you pay tabs on your car, you have to pay annual registration fees for an aircraft. If you fail to pay those fees on time, there is a fee, appropriately, of course. But the fee schedule that the state currently uses was very punitive. So if you have a $15 aircraft excise tax fee that you don't pay on time, that could increase to over $450 in a very short amount of time. We felt, and our aviation task force here at AWB felt that was more punitive. We'd rather see a fine schedule that was acted more as an incentive to try to get people to pay. So Representative Dent had a bill this year to limit the fine schedule on those aircraft excise taxes, and the bill did pass. We expect the governor to sign it tomorrow in his batch of bill signings as well. Alternative fuels. Last year we created an incentive program for commercial vehicles to convert over to alternative fuels. This year we had a bill that would tweak that a little bit and include leased vehicles. When we created the program last year, we did not intend to exclude leased vehicles from qualifying for the program, and we had some members this year who wanted to add leased vehicles to the program, and we were able to get that bill across the finish line and expect the governor to sign it also tomorrow. Two initiatives that we'll be working on later this year, Initiative 1421 and Initiative 1454. Both of these are transportation related. Initiative 1421 is a Tim Eyman initiative that limits car tabs to $30. This is his fourth attempt to limit car tabs to $30, and it is expected to cost the transportation budget about $3 billion over 10 years. Initiative 1454 would repeal some of the gas tax increases that we saw last year in the Connecting Washington package. It would also create and reform the public-private partnership system that we have in Washington. We'll be discussing both of these initiatives at our next Transportation Committee meeting coming up in a couple of weeks and deciding how we want to proceed with them throughout the year. Now I want to transition real quick to land use in the last few minutes I have remaining. Land use was a very active issue this year. We have our vesting issue. We've had a very active task force working on vesting among AWB here internally to try to come up with an agreement to continue to protect vesting rights in Washington. We had a bill draft earlier in the year. Lawmakers chose not to drop or introduce that bill. So we'll continue through the stakeholders process this interim and trying to come up with an agreement for 2017 session on protecting vesting rights in Washington. And then we have our State Building Code Council reform bills that were introduced this year as well. The State Building Code Council has in previous years asked for a fee increase to fund additional operations at the State Building Code Council. The business community has resisted those fee increases because we want to see reforms. If you've ever attended a State Building Code Council meeting, you'll understand why the business community is insisting on reforms. I don't think I'm overstating it when I say it's a dysfunctional organization. They have many examples where they don't follow their own internal bylaws, nor do they follow APA requirements at the state level. There's been audits and lawsuits against the State Building Code Council ongoing now. So we did not want to give them a fee increase unless we saw reforms. So there were a couple of bills this year that would have restructured the Building Code Council in exchange for reforms. The legislature did not pass those bills, so we'll continue working with our membership throughout the interim and coming up with a good solution to fix the Building Code Council, because right now it's not serving our members appropriately as it should. And I'm available for any questions.
Any questions that you have of Mike? Doesn't look like it. Thank you, Mike. Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Amy.
Good morning. Thank you, Gary. I'm Amy Anderson. I'm Government Affairs Director for Education and Workforce at AWB. We had several education bills this session addressing funding, class size, assessments, teacher salaries, and teacher shortages. The teacher salary issue is currently one of the big budget negotiation items happening right now. Teacher shortages were addressed through Senate Bill 6455, providing a mechanism for retired teachers to return as substitute teachers, and as well as providing a program to recruit, retain, and mentor our K-12 teachers. Our state's K-12 education assessment program was kept in place. We see this as a win, providing consistency for both our students and our teachers. The first bill of the session to pass both houses and be signed by the governor was Senate Bill 6195, which established the Education Funding Task Force. The EFTF is created to address the education funding issues brought forth in the Supreme Court McCleary decision. The task force must make recommendations regarding teacher compensation, again part of the budget negotiations currently going on, all-day kindergarten and K-3 class size reductions, educator recruitment and retention programs. As I mentioned earlier, we do face a teacher shortage issue in Washington State, maintenance and operation levies, and levy equalization. This year, we also were able to continue the current local levies to get us through to next session. The levy equalization or levy swap issue is going to be one of the bigger issues that we're facing in next session, and something we'll be addressing over the interim. It is required through the Supreme Court decision that the local school districts must take the reliance off the local levies to fund basic education services, such as teacher salaries, and put that back onto the states. Basically, the local levies must be used for local enrichment programs, and that's it. School district collective bargaining will also be a piece that the task force will be looking at, as will clarifying the distinction between basic education and local enrichment services. Again, that's important as we look at how much of the local levy dollars need to be raised to support education, and how much of that money needs to be funneled through the state to support our basic education services. School employee health benefits and sources of state revenue to support the state statutory requirement of funding basic education will also be looked at through this task force. Of course, our other big contentious issue in education was charter schools. With a House vote of 58-39 and a Senate vote of 26-23, Senate Bill 6194 was delivered to the governor on Thursday, March 10th for his signature. He has not signed it yet. He has not vetoed it yet. But if no action is taken by the end of next week, it will come into law. 6194 reenacts Initiative 1240, which was the initiative that authorized charter schools for the state of Washington. It redefines charter schools as not common schools. That was one of the main issues in the Supreme Court case released the 1st of September that stated that charter schools were unconstitutional. The bill also restructurizes the authorization process for charter schools. It provides two different authorizing entities, one at the state level and one at the school district level, if the school district does decide to be an authorizer. It also restructures the state's charter school commission, which oversees the state's charter schools. It puts the commission now under the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. And it specifies the Washington Opportunity Pathways account as the funding vehicle for charter schools. Another one of those key issues in the Supreme Court decision stating that charter schools were unconstitutional was the funding sources. The funding was taken out of the general fund, which is meant to be for our basic education services. Charter schools are not considered common schools, therefore we needed to make sure that there was a different funding mechanism, and that is the Washington Opportunities Pathways account. As we move through the interim and prepare for the 2017 session, we anticipate the key issues to be how we fund our basic education services and how we establish local levies as a vehicle to be used as to fund only local enrichment services and not basic education, which must be funded at the state level. Our state education system is the vehicle to prepare our next generation of workforce. So it is imperative that the system prepares our students with the skills needed for our businesses to be able to grow and be our economic vehicle. Any questions?
Thank you, Amy. Any questions for Amy? One of the things to note here that Amy will be tracking all summer long is this committee, this Education Funding Task Force, as they proceed and go through the summer. Because as Amy said, this is going to be key for us coming back into 2017, because this will be key as to defining how much money is left to pay into for the McCleary decision. So it's going to be very key that AWB track this throughout the summer and watch and see how much money is that going to be for the next biennium. So any questions for Amy? Thank you, Amy. Amy. And next we'll have Bob. Morning, Bob.
Morning. Thank you, Bob Battles, Director of Government Affairs for Employment Law. We had a short session, but you wouldn't know that by the number of bills that moved through in the employment law area. There was a phenomenal amount of areas that were hit, such as workers' comp, biometrics, non-compete agreements, wage theft and anti-retaliation, and even unemployment bills came in. But I want to focus on three areas specifically: minimum wage, pregnancy accommodations, and equal pay or pay equity are three areas that we're dealing with. First, on the minimum wage, several bills were introduced or continued from the previous session. One main bill that was given a hearing this year was Senate Bill 6087, and that bill, when we addressed that bill, we looked at that through our 5 principles that we have at AWB for addressing minimum wage. That bill covered 3 of those principles. Those principles, again, are statewide solution, a phase-in over time, teen wages, training wages, and an acknowledgement of some sort of total compensation that employers have more costs than just labor. That bill didn't meet all those costs, but we were encouraged that it was going in the right direction. However, that bill failed to move out of committee. Again, AWB doesn't necessarily support, or we don't support a minimum wage increase, but we believe that it is out there that we're going to have to deal with that. That being said, an initiative has been filed as well. Initiative 1433. 1433 is currently gathering signatures. That minimum wage initiative would increase the minimum wage to $13.50 in 4 years, and it would also have a safe and sick leave provision. That safe and sick leave provision is for every hour worked, or for every 40 hours worked is 1 hour. That provision tends to be very confusing at what that actually is going to entail. That could be as much as 12 days a year potentially after the second year in the way it could be interpreted. An alternative initiative has been also dropped currently and is being evaluated and looking for a title with the Attorney General's office. That's been put in by the Restaurant Association. That is a $12 minimum wage provision. It still has a safe and sick leave, but it would be very similar to the Tacoma system out there, so very clearly defined as a 24-hour than a 5-day type requirement, so much more clearly defined. That again is not been determined whether it's how far it will go, but at this point it is being evaluated. This next area that we want to deal with is pregnancy accommodation. There was a bill that moved through, or there were several bills, but one bill that actually moved out of the Senate. That's in gross substitute Senate Bill 61-49. This bill moved out of the Senate with a 49 to nothing bipartisan vote. It was a good bill that worked, business and labor worked together to try to find something that would be a good balance between the needs of pregnancy accommodations and the needs of businesses, especially the small businesses. Unfortunately, when it got over to the House, it was amended on 3 separate occasions in 2 different committees and on the floor, and it resulted in a passage out of the House in a very partisan way, almost along party lines. And unfortunately, then the bill did not move any further, and so therefore it failed to pass. And what has happened there is that what was hopefully a good compromise turned into a political fight. It's unfortunate. That bill we would expect to still see moving forward as well next year. The last one is pay equity, or equal pay. While we believe that the law is already the pay equity is already protected under both state and federal law, this bill is moving forward and did move forward in the House. The bill that passed the House, 1646, passed in a very partisan way again. It included several items that were a problem for business. One was that it had triple damages, one that it had dual causes of action, meaning you could be sued for simultaneously in 2 different jurisdictions for the same thing, and it also interfered with the day-to-day operations. When it got over to the Senate, business worked very hard trying to find a solution to see if we could find a compromise. We believe that a very good compromise was found and addressed, and that was based on the Senate bill version that was over in the Senate, and that bill resulted in eliminating those concerns, but still being able to have a good bill that would pass on behalf of equal pay. It, however, failed to move out of committee based on the fact that it did not have the proper signatures. We therefore were unable to see a solution on those bills. I want to state that all 3 of these items were also seen in the local jurisdictions. We're going to see these next year. We're going to see some of these on the November ballot. And I would just encourage each one of you to be engaged on these in your local jurisdiction, and to also engage here at the AWB, because this is something very important for us to make sure that we are finding a solution that works for all businesses. Do we have any questions?
Thank you, Bob. I want to remind everybody what Bob talked about at the first, and that's minimum wage. AWB has been tracking and working on this for the last 2 years. We've done many polls on it. Minimum wage among the public out there, it's about a 68% support from the public that minimum wage needs to go up. We've worked around a $12 minimum wage for a number of years, encompassing the pieces in it that Bob talked about. And as Bob said, there is an initiative supported by labor. We've been told they have $10 million to get the signatures and promote it, and that's $13.50 in 4 years with what would be passed out by the public. Polling shows that will pass. But at the same time, the Restaurant Association, and we've been in concert with them and talking with them, have also dropped one that would be $12 an hour in 4 years. And so you're going to be hearing us talk about that in the next few months as to whether we should support that $12 one. And the polling shows that the $12 one would be supported more than the $13.50 one. So please keep in contact and working with us on that. Are there any questions of Bob on any of these issues? Okay.
Thank you.
Eric? Eric's going to talk to us and give us a little update on the budget and some of the issues that he worked on.
Thank you, Gary. So Eric Lonis with the Association of Washington Business. I'm the new Tax and Fiscal Policy Director for Government Affairs. So this is, again, a supplemental year. So presumably they're going to come in, they're going to make some minor modifications, make some fine-tuned adjustments to last year's 2-year budget, and then they're going to get out of town. That was the conventional wisdom going into this. Some had speculated we might even be out 2 days early. The majority of people were surprised to find out that they were going to blow right past the 60-day time frame, and now we're halfway through the first special session without any clear agreement in sight. So again, this sort of blew original assumptions and conventional wisdom, but here we are. So I'm going to briefly cover a couple of different things. So tax and fiscal policy was pretty busy this year, so I'll look at some of the more policy-related items and then some of the more budget-proper items towards the end of my brief time here. So we had a number of successes this year. We went in with a pretty robust set of legislative objectives, and we came out of the session with bills that had passed both the House and the Senate. It is true that they are still waiting governor's signature, so they're on his desk, so we're going to see what happens there. But I'll run through those bills briefly. So you have 2540. It was a Representative Neely bill. This is a bill that modifies the penalty for failure to file a survey and report. This is one that's been very important to our members. It's currently at a draconian level of 100%, so you have to pay back the entire value of the preference. This brings it down to a tiered structure where you're going to end up paying 50% maximum if you don't turn it in on time. So the penalty's still there. They still have that policy lever to get you to turn in your survey and report, but at the same time, it's not overly punitive. The next bill is 2565, which is a Representative Vick bill. It brings the number of times local jurisdictions can change the sales tax from 4 times annually down to 3 times annually. Again, it's a small improvement, but it's a very important improvement. We had some compelling testimony by Judy Couvert in particular, who showed just how difficult it is for her to have to come in and do this 4 times a year. And then House Bill 2959 is a bill by Representative Litton. Very thankful that she ran this bill and really worked hard on it. It's a task force bill, but it's a task force bill that I think is going to have a lot of value at the end of the process. So it's a bill that's going to bring the business community and the cities together to talk about solutions for streamlining local B&O taxes and licensing. There's a lot of disagreement on this issue, so the fact that the legislature has asked us and now forced us to sit at the table and work out some of our differences, we see this as a great sign. We look forward to working with the cities on this issue. So there were a number of bills that did not pass, or I should say policy issues, but we made improvements on. Those relates to consolidating the survey and report, relates to tax appeals reform, and then there were some economic development opportunities, which we viewed as multi-year initiatives. We made some improvements on those, really turned the dial, and put us in a good position to further press those issues next session. Tax preferences, I should say, received a lot of attention this year. You had the aerospace clawbacks. You had several bills that tried to roll back a number of different tax preferences. Some of those related to bottled water, prescription drugs, the agriculture, international investments, and that's just to name a few. As of yet, obviously we're still in session, the budget's still being worked. As of yet, none of those have passed, and to my knowledge, none of those have even passed their House of Origin. So whether or not they're being discussed behind closed doors is a separate question, but none of those, again, have passed their original House of Origin. So we view that as a positive step. So to the budget proper, and Gary touched on this in his opening comments, but we came into this session with a number of looming issues. So we had historic wildfires, which everybody agreed needed to be funded somehow. Those are from 2015. So we needed to backfill funds for that. We had the Healthcare Authority, which has also received a lot of attention, and Sherry mentioned this earlier. They came in with, I want to say, about a $390 million hole in their budget over 4 years related to low-income medical and related to long-term care. So that was a problem right out of the gate the legislature needed to address. And then there were additional expenditures being requested for a number of other policy areas too, specifically mental health. There were a number of expenditures that needed to be made, particularly for the state hospitals, so Western State and Eastern State. So these are real problems that needed to be addressed. But there are also problems that could be addressed relatively quickly, if not for, I guess, some of the political complications that we ran into this session. So as we sit right now, House budget, last one that passed, raises spending, I believe, about $480 million for the current budget. The last Senate budget that passed out, I believe, raises it about $180 million, and that's a large increase over their last offer, but it's still obviously substantially lower than what the House is asking for right now. So what we saw in the last budget is considerable movement towards the House's position. So they raised the number of dollars they were willing to spend. They were willing, whereas previously they were not. They were then willing to spend $190 million out of the budget stabilization account to fund wildfires. So again, what we've seen is considerable movement on the Senate side, which is promising. Where we stand right now is, they're at closed door negotiations. I think some of the things they've been talking about since the beginning, additional K-12 expenditures, mental health, other healthcare expenditures, long-term care perhaps. These are all things that are being talked about, and we're looking closely at their conversations. We're keeping our ear to the ground, and we will certainly notify everybody as soon as we have further developments.
Thank you, Eric. Any questions for Eric? I might mention, as you hear going throughout the session, you hear a number of legislators on the floor talking about 640 tax exemptions that the business community has. And certainly Senator Carlisle now, was former legislator, talks about those all the time. 640 tax exemptions that the business community has. Remember, we don't have 640. They all know that. Especially one of the largest tax incentives is one that we consumers have, and that's sales tax on food. But it was interesting this year that all those people talk about too many tax incentives were all very supportive of one new tax incentive. And that was to take sales tax off of martial arts classes. So when they talk about having too many tax incentives, those same ones turn right around and say, whoops, now we're at 641. So it's kind of interesting how they talk about tax incentives. They don't like them, but then they turn around because in their area, maybe somebody brought forward this issue that it's causing problems for martial arts classes that they found out now. Department of Revenue says you should be collecting sales tax. And so those same legislators come in and say, no, they shouldn't be collecting it, so now we have another tax incentive. So I just had to throw that out. It's just interesting how the legislators talk about tax incentives, but then turn around themselves and bring one more in this year. So thank you, Eric. And last but certainly not least is Brandon.
Thank you, Gary. Excuse me, my name is Brandon Huskeeper, Government Affairs Director for Environmental Policy here at AWB. And there's 3 key points that I'd like to share with you this morning and touch on and talk about why you should care about those issues and how they are each cost drivers to businesses in the state of Washington. So first I want to talk to you about toxics reductions in the state of Washington. There's an ongoing effort both in the legislative arena as well in the regulatory arena to try and regulate chemicals and commerce in the state of Washington, creating a complex regulatory scheme for businesses that operate on a national and even international basis. We've dealt with legislation over the last several years to reduce toxics threats in our state. The governor had legislation that he sponsored last year to broadly regulate chemicals in commerce. And this year we continue to work on a flame retardant bill to ban chemicals, chemical flame retardants in children's safe products through the Children's Safe Products Act. AWB was able to lead a coalition of our members and others to come to compromise on legislation that would work for us, banning some key chemicals from commerce, and yet at the same time providing a process in the regulatory environment that our members could have some regulatory certainty with in moving forward and how they work with the Department of Health and Department of Commerce in our state. And so I think that's an issue that folks are going to want to continue to watch, even though we struck this grand bargain this year on flame retardants. We've already heard from proponents that they plan to come back and look at how to regulate chemicals such as cosmetics being sold in the state of Washington. So we're going to have to continue to watch that effort. In addition, I want to just briefly touch with you on water quality standards in the state of Washington. For more than 4 years, we've been dealing with the development of water quality standards in Washington state. And so a lot of folks immediately turn their attention off when we talk about water quality standards, because most businesses or most consumers in the state say, why does that impact me? So let me give you an example of why you should care. Several years ago, working with our partners in the water quality arena, the cities and the counties and the port districts in the state, we funded a study to look at the technologies that would be needed if the state were to implement these type of water quality standards, similar to what Oregon has to the south of us. And what we found in doing that is that the technology that would be required to be implemented would cause utility ratepayers to pay an additional $200 per month to implement this new technology and still not be able to meet the standards that the state of Washington was looking at adopting. Again, we've worked on this for more than 4 years. Currently, we're in the final steps of public comment on the state's draft rules. We also have federal pressure where EPA is looking over our state shoulder and proposing their own regulatory rules. And so we are working with our members to submit robust comments and try and find regulatory relief for businesses in the state, to try and avoid those high costs to both businesses and to our customers and consumers in the state. Finally, let me just spend a few minutes talking with you about climate change. Governor Inslee started the 2016 session by talking about a rule on carbon that he wanted to implement that would drive down greenhouse gas emissions for the state. And so he is pursuing that through executive order here in our state, working with the Department of Ecology and other agencies to try and put a carbon cap in place. In addition to that, proponents from environmental groups brought forward legislation that in the form of an initiative to the legislature to try and drive a carbon tax, what they're calling a revenue neutral carbon tax, to be adopted by the legislature. And so we have been working both in the regulatory environment and in the legislative environment to address the governor's rulemaking effort as well as this carbon tax proposal. If I give you a little bit of context of what that might mean to you. Last year, the governor brought forward in the 2015 legislative session a Carbon Pollution Accountability Act, essentially a cap and trade proposal that was similar to the carbon tax proposal and very similar to his carbon cap rule. In that proposal, his own office said that we would see, as a result of that proposal, new revenues or taxes collected by the state to the tune of about $1.3 billion. And that was expressed as something like 12 cents per gallon at the pump on a gallon of gas. It was something like 10 to 12 cents on a kilowatt of electricity, and it represented a 22% increase in the cost of natural gas prices through the year 2035. These have broad implications for energy-intensive, trade-exposed companies in our state, which Washington has a robust manufacturing sector that uses a lot of energy to produce its widgets for exporting to other states and countries. And what would that mean? What do those cost drivers mean to them, and the regulatory uncertainty of those type of proposals mean to them? So where we sit today is the governor's office withdrew their rule for a period of time based on comments and feedback that the business community and other stakeholders provided to the governor's office and Department of Ecology. They realized that there was flaws in their thinking of how they were planning to approach the rule and putting a carbon cap in place. Unfortunately, they plan to come back in about mid-May with a new proposal and submit a new rule that the business community will have to evaluate and look at the cost drivers on. In addition to that, we are still looking at ballot initiatives that are moving forward. The carbon tax initiative that was submitted to the legislature is now officially qualified for the ballot, and we are leading a robust business effort along with other stakeholders to look at that initiative and do legal analysis, economic analysis, and look at what that means to businesses and how we might be able to tell our story of what those costs will be if an initiative passes. So That initiative will be on the ballot in 2016, and you can expect to see more information from us moving forward. There's certainly a lot of work going on in the environmental arena, all of which are cost drivers to you, and we look forward to continuing to work with you to better understand those costs and implications. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Let me go back and make sure that everybody understands. And the water quality rule, as it stands, if it goes forward with what the governor proposes, if a municipality put the best technology that is out there today, through our cost analysis, shows that it would raise $200 a month to that homeowner. But the important thing is, they would still not meet that standard. So what our governor wants to do through agencies, and remember, this is similar to what's going on back in DC. If I can't get my issue through Congress, or if I can't get my issue through the legislature, then I go through the rulemaking. And that's what the governor's doing here on the water quality. I can't get this issue through the legislature, I'm going through the rulemaking. And through the rulemaking now, we will have a water quality standard that no industry, no municipality, that standard, there is no technology today, nor in the near future, that will be able to meet that standard. Why would we push out a standard, and what does that do to the competitiveness of our businesses here in the state of Washington? At the same time we're working on that rule, and we've been working on it, as Brandon said, for 4 years, he hasn't been able to get legislation through around carbon reduction. And remember, we are one of the greenest states and the lowest carbon emitter state, but we can't get it out, so now we're going through rulemaking through the agency once again to get standards on our industries to put us once again at a competitive disadvantage, those industries also. So these are concerns that we have. We're seeing issues move out of the legislative arena now over into our agencies through the rulemaking process, avoiding the legislature and the elected bodies that you vote to go in and take care of these issues for us. So this is a major concern that we have, that we're seeing more and more happen in our state, is on big issues, can't get my agenda through the legislature, then I'm going to go through the rulemaking process. And so we're very concerned about these two main issues going forward, and looking down the road, what other issues are going to wind up going to a state agency versus going through the legislative process. So I want to thank each and every one of you once again for tuning in with us today. I want to thank my staff, your staff. They're here to help you with your issues that you have. If you have issues, if you have questions today we didn't get answered, please email me, garyc@awb.org. We will make sure those questions get answered for you, and I'll have the appropriate staff get back and answer those questions to you. In closing, I want to remind you that this summer coming up, we have an awful lot of events coming down the pike for each and every one of you. You're going to have an opportunity to see every one of these staff out on the road. So I want to remind you, we have a spring board meeting coming up in June, the 14th in Spokane. We are doing, for the first time ever at AWB, we will be doing a small business listening session. We're going to be going around the state to 11 different areas, talking about small business issues. What issues do you as a small business have? If you have a regulatory reform issue, you got to tell us what that regulatory reform means to you. So we're going to be coming to you to listen to you as a small business person. What are those issues that are most pertinent to you, so that we can come back and have a small business agenda for the 2017 session. We have employment law seminars that are coming up the second Wednesday of each month. Make sure you turn into those. We have regional meetings that start in August, that all of the staff will be coming around and talking about and getting prepped for next session. And then we have our policy summit that we have in September. So we have many other things put in between there. We have a manufacturing summit also. We're talking about maybe doing an education summit. So be tuned in, watching our website and watching for all the different programs that we have in tune for you for this summer. So with that, unless there's any questions I need to answer right now, I think we are done, and thank you once again for tuning in.